If you want loud mixes that compete against mainstream releases, you can't leave it all for mastering. It's not just about throwing a bunch of limiters on your mix bus. It's not even about doing a whole bunch of limiting on your individual tracks. It goes a lot deeper than that. You really have to build that loudness into your mix from the ground up. So I'm gonna walk you through 4 keys to help you get louder sounding mixes. So here's a mix of mine. This is a song called Somnia by the band Auras. And this track here, this is my final mix that I printed down and sent off to mastering. So it's not crazy loud, but it's decently loud. I'll play a little snippet here. So on my mix bus chain here, I've just got a few dB of compression on the SSL bus comp. And then I've got this Slate FGX plugin just to bring my peaks kind of up to 0, and it's shaving off maybe a tiny bit of the transient, but it's really not working that hard. And if we want to check the level of this, about -10, -10.5 LUFS. So plenty of room left for the mastering engineer to crank this up more, but still there's a good amount of loudness here in the mix. Now, we did get an awesome master back. Shout out to Mike Kalajian, who absolutely killed this. Here's the master here. Let's check that out. I did volume match this, so it's not gonna blow your ears off. All right, I'm gonna A-B back and forth. Okay, let's check out how loud the master is. About -5.5 LUFS. I mean, you can't really get much louder than this. We hear a little bit of crunchiness. You know, there's a little bit of edge to it, which you'd expect from getting a master this loud. But to me, I love this because it's aggressive, it's in your face, but I can still hear the punch of the drums, and the drums are not getting totally squashed down and lost and buried, which often happens with really loud masters done poorly. So to me, to my ears, this just sounds a little brighter. You know, he's opened up the top end a little bit on my mix, but the balance, the transients, the drums, everything has stayed really intact. So if you mix for loudness, you're going to be able to get a lot more of it out of mastering. And the first key to loudness has nothing to do with dynamics, actually. It's about EQ. It's nailing the mid-range. And essentially, the more mid-range content you have in your mix, the louder your mix is going to sound. Now, why is this? Well, there's a concept in audio called the Fletcherson Curve, and it basically explains how, as humans, we perceive different frequencies as louder or softer. So what this curve is showing is how much sound intensity in terms of SPL and in decibels are needed in order for us to perceive the same level of loudness. So as you go more towards the low end of the spectrum, you'll see that you actually need to pump out a lot more energy in terms of decibels in order to perceive the same level of loudness as, let's say, 1K or 500 or 750 hertz. And you can see in the upper mid-range, probably around 4 or 5K-ish, our ears are really sensitive in that area, so it takes less sound pressure intensity. And you can see the same is true of the top end. As we get 10K and above, it requires more intensity, more SPLs for us to perceive those frequencies as the same level of loudness as the mid-range frequencies. Now, this might seem a little bit confusing, but I'll just demonstrate this in Pro Tools by simply putting an EQ on my mix here. So let's fire this up. Now I'm going to play the mix and listen to what happens when I start dipping out some of that mid-range. crazy difference, right? Just kind of a broad scoop around, 700 hertz. Here, I'll even do it less drastic, just a couple dB. You can see when we take that mid-range out, it sounds so much quieter. It sounds like I've done a lot more than just take out a little bit of, 700. What all this means is that to get that loud sound, you need to have enough of that mid-range content in your mix. And the pros really nail this. I remember when I was more of a beginner coming up, I used to grab CDs that I got and I would really love the mix, think it sounded great in my car or whatever. And I bring it into the studio to listen through my studio monitors. And I was often like shocked, wow, this sounds like so mid-rangey and kind of nasty, right? In my studio compared to the stuff I was doing, at least. And this is a common problem that a lot of amateur mixers have. They end up with more of a scooped curve in their mixes, kind of like a smiley face shaped, right? And it's pleasing at first when you do that scoop and you boost the top end and bottom end. But if you want loudness, this really messes you up. Think of that Fletcherson curve again. Like, you need that much more low end to achieve the same perceived level of loudness. Same thing with the high end. But if you're adding all that extra low end, well, that's eating up a ton of headroom in your mix. Those low frequencies contain the most energy, right? So that means on the mix bus or at mastering, you're going to have to do way more limiting, way more compression on the overall mix, which is going to make everything worse. So that's not good, right? So in general, you need to focus on having more of this mid-range content in your mixes. Stop scooping everything. It really is a dance of kind of trying to cram in all of the tracks in your mix into this mid-range sweet spot without having things sound crowded or overbearing. Obviously, we need to do this in a pleasing musical way, but that really is part of the key. All right, the second key is using a lot of compression. Okay, a lot of compression on individual tracks. Now, I want to be careful when I'm giving this advice. I'm not just saying go ahead and slam every track in your mix with compression, with no thought or skill. Okay, of course, this takes experience, knowledge, guidance. You've got to put in some reps and some time and learn how to do this effectively. But the fact is, a modern pro rock or pop mix uses a lot of compression to shape the sound, and that contributes, of course, to the overall loudness. So looking at my mix again, if I switch to this mix view here, you see in Pro Tools beside the meter, there's this yellow gain reduction meter. So if we look all the way from like kick drum, snare, overheads, rooms, you're going to see a lot of compression everywhere. Then we get to our drum buses. We've got a regular drum compression bus. Then we've got a parallel compression bus. Slamming it a lot more and then blending that in. Then our bass, we've got a bunch happening. Even rhythm guitars, compression. And all the synth tracks here. Compression on all those individual tracks. Vocals, of course, there's going to be a lot. Let me skip to a chorus here. Lots of compression, right? And to get things loud, we need less dynamic range. This is a relatively simple concept, right? We need the peaks of our audio to come down, and we need the valleys to come up. That's how we get things to sound louder. Compression does exactly that, and it's also kind of become part of the sound of modern records. It's part of the tone and flavor of how pop and rock sound these days. But people fall off the track on either side, right? They either don't use enough compression at all, or they use way too much, or they're too heavy-handed, especially on the mix bus. And I think that the key is spreading that compression out across a lot of individual tracks, of course, with taste, with skill, but you got to use a lot of it. And if you do it that way, by the time you get to the mix bus, you really don't need that much. Again, I'm using about 4 dB here. frankly, this is kind of pushing the limit of where I usually am. I'm usually somewhere between 2 and 4 dB of gain reduction on my mix bus. All right, the third key to mixing for loudness is saturation. Lots of saturation. So let's check out my mix again. And what I'm going to do right now is bypass all of the saturation plugins that I have on my mix here. So first I got to bypass heat, which is a Pro Tools feature which applies saturation across all the individual tracks of my mix. So we'll bypass that, and then bear with me here. I'm going to bypass all the saturation on my individual tracks. There's going to be a lot of it. Okay, I'm going to play this unsaturated version of my mix, and I'll flip back and forth between that and the actual mix with the saturation on. I mean, that is a pretty dramatic difference, I would say. So why? Why saturation, okay? Well, saturation kind of does all of the things that I've talked about already in a subtle way, right? It's number one, adding more harmonic content. So it's taking the individual tracks we have and then adding more harmonics, filling in more space in the mid-range. Okay, so that's point number one, right? Getting more mid-range content. Secondly, it's also compressing the signal. So it's kind of rounding off some of the peaks of the transients. It's reducing dynamic range a little bit, doing that in a really subtle, musical, pleasing way. And again, this is not something that you just slap on the mix bus at the end, all right? You need to layer this saturation into your mix from the ground up on individual tracks as needed. Finally, the last key I'm going to talk about here, this is really powerful, especially in rock and heavy music. It's clipping, okay? Using clipping on purpose. And where this really helps the most in the mix is on your drums. So the drums naturally are providing all of the transient peaks in your mixes, right? Now, the more of those transient peaks you have and the bigger they are, by the time you get to the mix bus and to mastering, and you've got a limiter or compressor, you're trying to reduce the dynamic range, well, the limiter is going to grab those big peaks, it's going to turn them down, but since it's on the mix as a whole, what that limiter is doing is also going to affect the balance and the tone and everything else in your mix at the same time. So what you want to do is take care of some of that on the drum bus instead. That way, your final mastering clipper or final mastering limiter, it doesn't have to work nearly as hard on the final mix as it would if those drum peaks were left fully intact. So let me demo this for you and explain with this mix. So I'll solo the drums. At the very end of my drum bus chain here, I have a clipping plugin. And what this is doing is just shaving off the top of the peaks of my drum transients. But it's doing it in an extremely transparent way because those peaks of those transients, they happen so fast, right? That if we just shave those off, like straight up, just clip them off, like imagine just taking a pair of scissors to the waveform and just clipping it off, we don't really hear that. And if we push it harder, you will start to hear a little bit of crunchiness or distortion, but the heavier the music is, the more aggressive, a rock mix is, sometimes that little bit of edginess and crunchiness, if it's subtle, it's actually not bad. It's kind of pleasing up to a certain point. So we can handle this on the drum bus, not too aggressively, a few dB at the most is what I like to do. So I have it here on my drum bus. And I have it catching the peaks on my parallel compression bus as well. And that's kind of providing my ceiling in the mix, right? So what we're doing is we're taking those peaks down, chopping them off, reducing the dynamic range of the drums, which is the most dynamic instrument. And then we can keep those drums nice and loud and punchy, and then start to fill in all the other instruments around it. And again, that way, once you get to the mix bus or in the mastering stage, you don't have to work as hard or do as much of that clipping, distortion, limiting, compression, whatever, on the mix as a whole. So everything, your drums, your transients, your balance, the mid-range, all of that can stay much more intact by the time you get to the final master. So that's how you can start getting louder sounding mixes. as usual, it's not one secret thing, right? It's a bunch of factors that all work together. So keep this in mind next time you're mixing. And if you want to dive a little deeper into how to use clipping specifically, both in mixing and in mastering, go ahead, check out this video right here.